He laughed at a poor girl in the restaurant, but when he found out who she really was, his world fell apart. He couldn't stop himself from laughing. The sight of her, this young woman clearly out of place in a restaurant where only the wealthiest dined, was too much for him to ignore. Dressed in clothes far beneath the elegance of her surroundings, she stood there, vulnerable, while his mocking laughter filled the room. But there was something about her, something in the way she held her gaze, her silence, her restraint, that hinted at a secret that, if he knew, would change everything. What he didn't realize in that moment was that his world was about to unravel. This wasn't just any girl. She had a past he couldn't even begin to imagine. A story woven with pain, strength, and a power he never saw coming. And as he stood there, blinded by arrogance, the path ahead of him was already set in motion. A path that would lead to a reckoning he would never forget. What could possibly be hiding behind those eyes? Who was she? The answers would shake him to his very core and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of anticipation as the sun began to set over the bustling streets of New York City. The Golden Leaf, an upscale restaurant known for its exquisite cuisine and even more exquisite clientele, stood as a beacon of luxury amidst the city's skyline. Its warm golden light spilled onto the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the young woman who hesitantly approached its ornate entrance. Sarah Thompson, barely 25, took a deep breath, her trembling hand smoothing down the wrinkles of her second-hand dress. The fabric, once a vibrant blue, had faded to a dull shade that seemed to mirror the weariness in her eyes. She glanced down at her scuffed shoes, a stark reminder of the life she'd left behind in her small Midwest town. With one last nervous adjustment of her unruly curls, she pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into a world that felt entirely foreign. The maitre d' raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over Sarah's attire with poorly concealed disdain. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. Sarah's cheeks flushed as she fumbled in her worn purse. Yes, under Thompson," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The maitre d' checked his list, surprise flickering across his face as he found her name. With a curt nod, he led her to a table near the center of the room. As Sarah walked through the restaurant, she felt the weight of curious stares boring into her. The clinking of fine china and the murmur of polite conversation seemed to fade, replaced by hushed whispers and not-so-subtle glances. She kept her eyes fixed on the carpeted floor, willing herself to disappear. Settling into her seat, Sarah picked up the menu with shaking hands. The prices made her eyes widen in shock. A single appetizer cost more than she made in a day at the hospital where she volunteered. She blinked back tears, reminding herself why she was here. This dinner was a gift, a rare opportunity she couldn't pass up. But as she struggled to decipher the French names of dishes, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. At a nearby table, Richard Blackwell, a distinguished man in his early 60s, sat nursing a glass of expensive scotch. His expertly tailored suit and confident demeanor spoke of wealth and influence. He had been observing Sarah since she entered, his lips curling into a sneer as he watched her obvious discomfort. "Well, well," he muttered to his dining companion, a younger man who hung on his every word. "Looks like the shelter's giving out fine dining vouchers these days." His voice, though low, carried just far enough for Sarah to hear. She flinched, shrinking further into her seat. Richard's companion chuckled nervously, glancing between him and Sarah. Emboldened by the reaction, Richard continued, his voice growing louder. "I mean, really, what's next? Are we going to start seeing panhandlers asking for caviar instead of spare change?" A few nearby diners tittered, and Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation. She tried to focus on the menu, but the words blurred as tears threatened to spill over. Richard, fueled by the attention, stood up dramatically. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I think you might have wandered into the wrong establishment. The soup kitchen is a few blocks down." The restaurant fell silent, all eyes now fixed on Sarah. She looked up, meeting Richard's gaze for the first time. In that moment, something flashed in her eyes. a mixture of pain, defiance, and a depth of experience that seemed at odds with her young face. For a split second, Richard faltered, a flicker of recognition passing over his features. But the moment passed and his arrogant smirk returned. "Come on, honey," he said, his voice softer but no less cruel. "This isn't a place for people like you. Why don't you run along before you embarrass yourself further?" Sarah stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor in the oppressive silence. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and with a dignity that seemed to illuminate her from within, walked calmly towards the exit. As she passed Richard's table, she paused for just a moment. Their eyes met again, and this time it was Richard who looked away first, an inexplicable unease settling in his stomach. The door closed behind Sarah with a soft thud, leaving behind a restaurant full of people who suddenly found their meals far less appetizing. Conversation slowly resumed, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort that lingered in the air. Richard sat back down, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had come over him. He raised his glass, attempting to recapture his earlier bravado. "Well, that's one way to clear out the riffraff," he said with a forced laugh. But as he brought the scotch to his lips, his hand trembled slightly, causing the amber liquid to slosh against the crystal. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, and when he checked it, the color drained from his face. "Mr. Blackwell?" his companion asked, noticing the sudden change. "Is everything all right?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He stared at his phone, reading and rereading the message that had just shattered his world. His law firm, the one he had built from the ground up over decades, was crumbling. A major case had been lost, clients were jumping ship, and there were whispers of an ethics investigation. As the implications of this news washed over him, Richard's gaze drifted to the door where Sarah had exited moments ago. A chill ran down his spine as an inexplicable connection formed in his mind between his cruel words and this sudden downfall. The restaurant continued its elegant dance of diners and waiters, oblivious to the internal turmoil of one man. But for Richard Blackwell, the world had shifted on its axis. In the span of a few minutes, he had gone from being on top of the world to watching it crumble beneath his feet. And somewhere out in the cool New York night, a young woman named Sarah Thompson walked away, her steps growing more confident with each block she put between herself and the golden leaf. She wiped away a single tear, unaware that her silent dignity had set in motion a chain of events that would intertwine her fate with that of the man who had just humiliated her, in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. The cacophony of a bustling New York street faded into the background as Richard Blackwell stared blankly at the polished mahogany desk before him. The once proud office, adorned with accolades and mementos of a stellar career, now felt like a mausoleum to his fading glory. His fingers absently traced the outline of a frame, a photograph of a younger, more vibrant version of himself in police uniform. 20 years had passed since Richard hung up his badge, trading in the adrenaline of the streets for the calculated battles of the courtroom. He had been a decorated officer, known for his bravery and quick thinking. But one fateful night changed everything. The memory hit him like a physical blow, causing him to wince. Screeching tires, shattering glass, a child's terrified scream. The sounds echoed in his mind as clearly as if they were happening right outside his window. His hand unconsciously moved to his left leg, feeling the raised scar tissue hidden beneath his tailored pants. "Officer down! Officer down!" The frantic radio call still haunted his dreams. Richard shook his head, trying to dispel the ghosts of the past. He had survived that night, saved the child, but at a cost. The physical wounds had healed, leaving behind scars and a permanent limp. The emotional toll, however, had been far greater. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, his wife Emily and their 2 children all smiling brightly. It was taken years ago, before the accident, before the bitterness had set in. Now, Emily's calls went straight to voicemail, and his children's attempts at reconciliation were met with curt dismissals. A sharp knock on the door jolted him back to the present. "Mr. Blackwell, the partners are waiting for you in the conference room." Richard straightened his tie, steeling himself for the confrontation ahead. The firm he had built from the ground up was teetering on the brink of collapse. Clients were fleeing in droves, spooked by rumors of ethical violations and a string of high-profile losses. His colleagues, once sycophantic in their admiration, now whispered behind his back, their loyalty as fragile as his reputation. As he made his way down the corridor, snippets of hushed conversations reached his ears.
"Did you hear about the Steinman case? Complete disaster?"
"I heard the Bar Association is launching an investigation. What was he thinking taking on that pro bono case? It's like he's lost his edge." Richard's jaw clenched, his grip on his cane tightening until his knuckles turned white. He had clawed his way to the top, reinventing himself after his injury forced him out of the police force. He wouldn't let it all slip away now. Yet as he reached for the conference room door, an image flashed in his mind. The young woman from the restaurant. Her eyes filled with a quiet strength that had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For a moment he hesitated, a flicker of shame threatening to break through his carefully constructed armor of arrogance. But old habits die hard. Richard pushed the thought aside, squaring his shoulders and plastering on the confident smirk that had become his trademark. He had a battle to fight, a reputation to salvage. There was no room for doubt or remorse. As the door swung open, revealing a room full of wary faces, Richard Blackwell stepped into the fray, unaware that across town, the young woman he had humiliated was embarking on a journey that would irrevocably change both their lives. In a bustling emergency room in Queens, Sarah Thompson tied her curly hair back, her earlier humiliation at the restaurant replaced by focused determination. She may not have belonged in the world of fine dining and designer suits, but here, amidst the controlled chaos of St. Mary's Hospital, she was in her element. "Dr. Thompson, we need you in trauma too," a nurse called out, her voice urgent but controlled. Sarah moved swiftly, her scuffed shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. As she pushed through the swinging doors, the scene before her was a stark contrast to the opulent restaurant she had fled from hours earlier. A young boy lay on the gurney, his small body battered and broken. The monitors beeped frantically, each sound a desperate plea for help. Sarah's training kicked in immediately, her hands steady as she assessed the injuries. "Multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding," she reported calmly. "Let's get him to CT, stat." As she worked, a memory tugged at the edges of her consciousness. Another child, another emergency room, years ago. But Sarah pushed it aside, focusing on the present, on the life literally in her hands. Hours passed in a blur of activity. When Sarah finally emerged from the operating room, exhausted but triumphant, she was met with the tear-stained face of the boy's mother. "Is he—" The woman couldn't finish the sentence, her voice choked with fear. Sarah's face softened, a gentle smile breaking through her professional demeanor. "He's going to be okay," she said, her voice warm and reassuring. "Your son is very strong." The woman collapsed against her, sobbing with relief. Sarah held her, offering silent comfort, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. As the adrenaline of the emergency faded, Sarah found herself in the quiet of the doctor's lounge, staring at her reflection in the window. The young woman who had felt so out of place in that fancy restaurant seemed worlds away from the confident doctor who had just saved a child's life. Yet as she gazed at her reflection, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, what would that arrogant man from the restaurant think if he could see her now? Would he still dismiss her as worthless, undeserving of respect? She shook her head, chiding herself for even caring about his opinion. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, their paths would cross again. And next time, she wouldn't be the one walking away in silence. Little did Sarah know, as she prepared to face another long night of saving lives, that fate was already weaving an intricate web that would bring her face to face with Richard Blackwell once more, under circumstances neither of them could possibly anticipate. The steady beep of heart monitors filled the air as Sarah Thompson made her way through the dimly lit corridors of St. Mary's Hospital. The night shift was winding down, but her mind was far from restful. As she approached the nurse's station, a familiar face caught her eye, an elderly patient named Mrs. Rosenberg, her wrinkled hand waving Sarah over with surprising energy. "Dr. Thompson," Mrs. Rosenberg called out, her voice raspy but warm. "I was hoping to see you before you left." Sarah smiled, genuinely fond of the spirited octogenarian. "Mrs. Rosenberg, you should be resting. What's keeping you up at this hour?" The old woman's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Oh, just the usual. Reliving my glory days as a jazz singer in the village. But tonight, something else is on my mind. You seem troubled, dear. What's weighing on that big heart of yours?" Sarah hesitated, surprised by the perceptiveness of her patient. She was about to deflect when suddenly, the weight of the past few days came crashing down. Before she knew it, words were spilling out. About the restaurant, the cruel laughter, the feeling of utter humiliation. As she spoke, Sarah's mind drifted, and she found herself transported back to a day she had tried so hard to forget. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, much like the day of the restaurant incident. 12-year-old Sarah sat in the back seat of her parents' car, her nose buried in a book about human anatomy. The family was returning from a weekend trip to visit her grandmother upstate. "Sarah, honey," her mother called from the front seat. "Why don't you put that book down and enjoy the scenery?" Sarah looked up, about to protest, when suddenly her world exploded in a cacophony of screeching tires and shattering glass. The car spun wildly, metal crunching against metal. Sarah's scream was cut short as her head slammed against the window. When she came to, the world was a haze of smoke and pain. She could hear distant sirens growing louder by the second. Struggling to focus, Sarah realized she was pinned in the back seat, her parents motionless in the front. "Mom? Dad?" she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the chaos outside. Suddenly, a face appeared at the shattered window. A police officer, his eyes filled with determination and concern. "Hold on, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We're going to get you out of there." What happened next was a blur of metal groaning, glass tinkling, and the officer's constant stream of encouragement. Sarah remembered the searing pain as she was pulled from the wreckage, the officer cradling her in his arms as he carried her to safety. Just as they reached the ambulance, a secondary explosion rocked the accident scene. The officer stumbled, shielding Sarah with his body as debris rained down around them. She heard him cry out in pain, felt warm blood seeping through his uniform. But still, he didn't let her go until she was safely in the hands of the paramedics. As consciousness faded, the last thing Sarah saw was the officer's face, etched with pain but still managing a reassuring smile. "You're going to be okay, kid," he said softly. "You're stronger than you know." Back in the present, Sarah blinked away tears, surprised to find Mrs. Rosenberg holding her hand, the old woman's eyes glistening with empathy. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Rosenberg said softly. "What a burden you've been carrying, but don't you see? That officer was right. You are stronger than you know. Look at you now, saving lives, just like he saved yours." Sarah nodded, a mix of emotions swirling within her. For years, she had tried to track down the officer who had saved her life, wanting to thank him, to tell him how he had inspired her to become a doctor. But the chaos of that day had left details fuzzy, and her searches had always come up empty. As she bid goodnight to Mrs. Rosenberg and made her way out of the hospital, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was shifting. The memory of the accident, long suppressed, now burned brightly in her mind, intertwining with the more recent humiliation at the restaurant. She paused at the hospital entrance, the cool night air a stark contrast to the warmth inside. A nagging thought tugged at her consciousness, a fleeting moment of recognition in the arrogant man's eyes at the restaurant, quickly masked by cruelty. Could it be? Sarah shook her head, dismissing the thought as ridiculous. The kind officer who had saved her life couldn't possibly be the same as that bitter, cruel man. Yet, as she hailed a cab to take her home, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that her past and present were about to collide in ways she could never have imagined. Little did Sarah know. Across town, Richard Blackwell was tossing and turning in his luxurious penthouse, haunted by dreams of screeching tires, a child's scream, and a pair of familiar, defiant eyes that seemed to pierce right through his carefully constructed facade. As the first rays of dawn broke over the New York skyline, both Sarah and Richard were unknowingly standing on the precipice of a revelation that would shatter their worlds and force them to confront the tangled web of fate that had brought them together once more. The harsh fluorescent lights of the law firm's conference room cast unflattering shadows across Richard Blackwell's face, as he stared down his partners. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him, "I assure you these allegations are completely unfounded. The Steinman case was—" "Save it, Richard," interrupted Marcus Greenberg, the firm's managing partner. His voice was cold, devoid of the respect it once held. "We've all seen the evidence, the ethical violations, the mishandling of client funds. It's not just the Steinman case. This goes back years." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He had always prided himself on walking the line, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable in pursuit of victory. But now, it seemed, his chickens had come home to roost. "You can't be serious," he sputtered, his carefully cultivated composure cracking. "After everything I've done for this firm." "That's precisely the problem, Richard," said Sarah Goldstein, the youngest partner and once his most ardent supporter. "What you've done for this firm has put us all at risk. The Bar Association is launching a full investigation. We have no choice but to ask for your resignation." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Resignation. The end of everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for. In that moment, the weight of his actions came crashing down upon him. As he stumbled out of the conference room, his world spinning, Richard's mind flashed back to the restaurant, to the young woman he had so callously humiliated. Her eyes, filled with quiet dignity in the face of his cruelty, now seemed to mock him. Outside the towering skyscraper that housed his soon-to-be former law firm, Richard found himself adrift in a sea of rushing New Yorkers. For the first time in years, he felt small, insignificant. His phone buzzed incessantly, no doubt news of his downfall spreading like wildfire through the legal community. With nowhere else to go, Richard found himself wandering the streets of Manhattan, his designer shoes ill-suited for such aimless walking. As he passed by a small neighborhood diner, a commotion inside caught his attention. Through the window, he saw a group of young professionals gathered around a table, laughing and chatting animatedly. Among them was a face that made his heart skip a beat, the young woman from the restaurant. Sarah Thompson sat among her colleagues, her face alight with joy as she recounted a story, her hands gesturing expressively. Gone was the timid, overwhelmed girl from the Golden Leaf. Here was a woman confident in her element, respected and admired by those around her. Richard watched, transfixed, as Sarah's colleagues hung on her every word. He caught snippets of their conversation, something about a difficult surgery, a life saved against all odds. The pride and admiration in the eyes of those around her were unmistakable. As he stood there, an invisible observer to a world so different from his own, Richard felt a wave of shame wash over him. He remembered his own words at the restaurant, the cruel dismissal of someone he had deemed beneath him. Now, watching Sarah in her element, he realized how terribly wrong he had been. Just then, Sarah glanced up, her eyes meeting his through the window. For a moment, recognition flickered across her face, followed by a mix of emotions Richard couldn't quite decipher. He expected anger, perhaps satisfaction at his obvious fall from grace. Instead, he saw something that shook him to his core: compassion. Before he could process what had happened, Sarah had excused herself from her friends and was making her way toward the diner's exit. Richard panicked, unsure whether to flee or stand his ground. But his body, betraying him as it often did these days, refused to move. The bell above the diner's door jingled as Sarah stepped out onto the sidewalk. She approached Richard slowly, as if afraid he might bolt at any sudden movement. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't expect to see you in this part of town." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he possibly say to this woman he had wronged so terribly? Sarah studied him for a moment, taking in his disheveled appearance, the defeat evident in every line of his body. Then, to Richard's utter astonishment, she did something he never could have anticipated. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph or mockery, but one of genuine kindness. "You look like you could use a cup of coffee," she said softly. "Why don't you join us? I think we might have more to talk about than either of us realized." Richard stared at her, dumbfounded. This woman, whom he had publicly humiliated, was offering him kindness he knew he didn't deserve. In that moment, standing on a crowded New York sidewalk, Richard Blackwell felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. As Sarah held the diner door open, gesturing for him to enter, Richard took a hesitant step forward. He didn't know it yet, but this simple act of compassion was about to set in motion a chain of events that would force both of them to confront their shared past and the tangled web of fate that had brought them together once more. Little did they know, as they settled into a booth in that small neighborhood diner, that their lives were about to become irrevocably intertwined in ways neither of them could have possibly imagined. The fluorescent lights of Mount Sinai Hospital's emergency room buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the anxious faces in the waiting area. Richard Blackwell paced back and forth, his expensive loafers squeaking on the linoleum floor. His hands trembled as he ran them through his disheveled gray hair, a far cry from his usually immaculate appearance. "Mr. Blackwell?" a nurse called out, her voice cutting through the din of beeping machines and hushed conversations. Richard's head snapped up, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "Yes, how is she?" The nurse's expression softened slightly. "Your wife is stable, but the doctor would like to speak with you about her condition." Relief flooded through Richard, quickly followed by a wave of guilt. Emily, his wife of 30 years, had collapsed at home just hours after he had stormed out following another heated argument. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the midst of losing everything he thought defined him, he was faced with the possibility of losing the one person who had stood by him through it all. As he followed the nurse down the sterile hallway, Richard's mind raced. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of humiliation and loss. His career was in shambles, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. The legal community that once revered him now shunned him, his phone calls going unanswered, invitations rescinded. "Mr. Blackwell?" A voice pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see a young doctor approaching, her white coat pristine, her curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Richard's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. It was her, the woman from the restaurant, the one he had so cruelly humiliated. Dr. Sarah Thompson stood before him, her expression professional but with a hint of surprise in her eyes. "I'm Dr. Thompson. I've been overseeing your wife's care." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. Here he was at his lowest point, faced with the very person he had deemed unworthy of respect just weeks ago. Sarah's voice softened slightly, though her professionalism never wavered. "Your wife suffered a minor stroke, Mr. Blackwell. We've stabilized her condition, but she'll need careful monitoring and rehabilitation." As Sarah explained Emily's prognosis, Richard found himself struggling to focus. The medical jargon washed over him, but all he could think about was the last conversation he'd had with Emily. Harsh words exchanged, doors slammed, and now this. "Mr. Blackwell?" Sarah's voice cut through his haze of guilt and self-recrimination. "Do you have any questions?" Richard looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Gone was the timid young woman he had mocked at the restaurant. In her place stood a confident, capable doctor, holding his wife's fate in her hands. I don't deserve your help," Richard mumbled, the words escaping before he could stop them. Sarah's expression flickered for a moment, a mix of surprise and something else. Compassion, perhaps, crossing her features. "Mr. Blackwell, whatever our past interactions, I'm a doctor first. Your wife is my patient, and she'll receive the best care possible." Her words, delivered with quiet dignity, hit Richard like a physical blow. The stark contrast between her professionalism and his own recent behavior was painfully clear. As if sensing his inner turmoil, Sarah's tone softened slightly. "Your wife is asking for you. Would you like to see her now?" Richard nodded mutely, following Sarah down the hallway. As they walked, he couldn't help but notice the respect accorded to her by other staff members, the way patients' faces lit up when they saw her. It was a far cry from the way people now looked at him, with disdain, disappointment, or worst of all, pity. At Emily's bedside, Richard's carefully constructed walls finally crumbled. Seeing his vibrant, strong-willed wife looking so fragile, hooked up to various machines, broke something inside him. He collapsed into the chair beside her, grasping her hand as tears streamed down his face. "I'm so sorry, Em," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "For everything." As Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open, Richard became acutely aware of Sarah's presence behind him. He turned, expecting to see judgment or satisfaction in her eyes. Instead, he found only compassion and a deep, unspoken understanding. "I'll give you some privacy," Sarah said softly, moving towards the door. "But Mr. Blackwell, remember your wife needs your strength now. This is your chance to be the person she needs you to be." With those words, Sarah slipped out of the room, leaving Richard to face the consequences of his actions and the long road of redemption that lay ahead. As the door closed behind her, Sarah leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. The universe, it seemed, had a strange way of bringing things full circle. Little did she know that this unexpected reunion was just the beginning of a journey that would force both her and Richard to confront their shared past and the power of forgiveness. In that sterile hospital room, as Richard held his wife's hand and vowed to be a better man, the seeds of transformation were already taking root. The arrogant lawyer who had once laughed at a young woman's expense was gone, replaced by a humbled man facing the biggest challenge of his life. And Sarah, the doctor who had risen above her own pain to offer compassion, was about to discover that sometimes the greatest healing happens not in the body, but in the soul. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the air as Richard Blackwell sat vigil at his wife's bedside. Emily's condition had stabilized, but the road to recovery stretched long before them. As he watched her chest rise and fall with each breath, Richard's mind wandered, replaying the events that had led him to this moment of reckoning. A soft knock at the door startled him from his reverie. Dr. Sarah Thompson entered, her white coat crisp, her manner professional yet gentle. "Mr. Blackwell, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice low to avoid disturbing Emily's rest. Richard straightened in his chair, a mix of emotions swirling within him: gratitude, shame, and a gnawing sense that he was missing something crucial. "I'm managing," he replied, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Dr. Thompson, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for Emily." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the various monitors before turning back to Richard. "Mr. Blackwell, there's something I need to discuss with you. Would you mind stepping out into the hallway for a moment?" Anxiety gripped Richard's heart as he followed Sarah out of the room. Had Emily's condition worsened? Was there some complication they hadn't foreseen? In the quiet of the hallway, Sarah took a deep breath, her professional demeanor wavering for just a moment. "Mr. Blackwell, I've been going over your wife's medical history, and there's something that caught my attention. A car accident from about 15 years ago." Richard's brow furrowed. "Yes, it was a terrible night. Emily and I were driving home from a dinner party. A drunk driver ran a red light. We were lucky to survive." Sarah's eyes widened, a flash of recognition crossing her face. "Mr. Blackwell, were you a police officer then?" The question caught Richard off guard. Yes, I was, but how did you—" And then, like a bolt of lightning, the memory struck him. A crisp autumn night. The screech of tires, the acrid smell of smoke and gasoline. A young girl, trapped in the wreckage, her eyes wide with terror. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, his legs suddenly weak. He leaned against the wall for support, staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. "It was you. You were that little girl." Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I've been trying to piece it together ever since I saw you at the restaurant. I knew your face was familiar, but I couldn't place it. And then, when I was reviewing Emily's file, I saw the date of the accident, and everything just clicked." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Richard's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. You became a doctor because of that night?" Sarah smiled softly, wiping away a tear. "You saved my life, Mr. Blackwell. You pulled me from that car, shielded me from the explosion. I wanted to thank you, to tell you how much you inspired me. But by the time I was old enough to really start searching, you had already left the force." Richard's legs gave out and he slid down the wall to sit on the floor, his head in his hands. The cruel irony of it all was almost too much to bear. The young woman he had so callously humiliated at the restaurant was the very same child he had risked his life to save all those years ago. "I'm so sorry," he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. At the restaurant I've become someone I never wanted to be, someone my younger self would be ashamed of." Sarah knelt beside him, her hand hesitating for a moment before resting gently on his shoulder. "Mr. Blackwell, I won't pretend that what happened at the restaurant didn't hurt, but seeing you now, seeing how much you care for your wife, I think maybe that officer who saved me is still in there somewhere." Richard looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze. In her eyes he saw not judgment or condemnation, but a glimmer of hope. Hope for redemption, for second chances. "Dr. Thompson, Sarah," he said, his voice steadier now, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if you'll let me, I'd like to try to make things right. Not just with you, but with everyone I've wronged." Sarah stood, offering her hand to help Richard up. "I think that's a good place to start, Mr. Blackwell, and please call me Sarah." As they re-entered Emily's room, the air seemed clearer somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. Richard took his wife's hand, a newfound determination in his eyes. He had been given a second chance, not just with Sarah, but with life itself. And this time he was determined not to waste it. Unbeknownst to either of them, this moment of truth was just the beginning. The intertwining of their past and present would set in motion a series of events that would challenge them both, testing the limits of forgiveness, redemption, and the enduring power of human connection. As the New York City skyline glowed in the distance, visible through the hospital room window, Richard Blackwell and Sarah Thompson stood on the precipice of a journey neither could have anticipated, a journey that would redefine their understanding of justice, compassion, and the transformative power of second chances. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Central Park as Richard Blackwell walked slowly along a winding path, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement. Months had passed since that fateful day in the hospital, and the world had shifted on its axis in ways he never could have imagined. Emily's recovery had been arduous, but she was making steady progress. Their relationship, too, was healing, built anew on a foundation of honesty and humility that Richard had long forgotten. But today, his mind was focused on another relationship, one that had unexpectedly become central to his journey of redemption. As he approached the Bethesda fountain, he saw her, Dr. Sarah Thompson, sitting on a bench, her curly hair catching the late afternoon light. She stood as he approached, a warm smile on her face. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him, her voice tinged with a mixture of respect and familiarity. "Sarah," he replied, nodding. "Thank you for meeting me, and please call me Richard." They sat together, in comfortable silence settling between them as they watched children play by the fountain. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Sarah, about my life, my choices, the man I became." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've decided to testify against my former partners at the firm, to come clean about all the ethical violations, the corners we cut, the people we hurt." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Richard, that's a big decision, are you sure?" He nodded, a grim determination in his eyes. "It's the right thing to do. I've spent too many years justifying my actions, convincing myself that the end justified the means. But seeing you, remembering the officer I used to be, the man who would risk his life to save a child, I can't run from the truth anymore." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch conveying support and understanding. "It won't be easy," she said softly. "You'll be facing a lot of anger, maybe even legal consequences." "I know," Richard replied, his voice steady, "but it's a price I'm willing to pay. I want to make amends, to try and right some of the wrongs I've done, and I was hoping you might help me." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "Me? How?" Richard took a deep breath. "There's a pro bono clinic in the Bronx, serving underprivileged communities. They're always in need of legal advice, especially for medical cases. I was thinking, maybe we could volunteer there together. Your medical expertise, my legal knowledge, we could really make a difference." For a moment, Sarah was speechless. The man sitting beside her was a far cry from the arrogant lawyer who had humiliated her months ago. In his eyes, she saw genuine remorse, a desire for redemption, and something else, a spark of the brave officer who had saved her life all those years ago. "Richard," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I think that's a wonderful idea." As they continued to talk, planning their volunteer work and discussing ways to help those in need, neither of them noticed the group of men in suits approaching until it was too late. "Richard Blackwell?" a stern voice called out. They looked up to see several FBI agents standing before them. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." Richard stood slowly, his face a mask of calm resignation. He turned to Sarah, whose eyes were wide with shock. "I'm sorry you had to see this," he said softly. "But I knew it was coming. It's part of making things right." As the agents began to read him his rights, Richard felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see Sarah standing beside him, her chin raised defiantly. "I'll call Emily," she said, her voice steady. "And I'll find you a good lawyer, a honest one." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Sarah, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "You saved my life once, now it's my turn to help save yours." As the agents led Richard away, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and public scrutiny. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Sarah watched as Richard was escorted to a waiting car, her heart heavy but filled with a determination she hadn't felt since the day she decided to become a doctor. This wasn't the end of their story, she realized. In many ways, it was just the beginning. As the sun dipped below the New York skyline, casting the park in a golden glow, Sarah Thompson made a silent vow. She would stand by Richard Blackwell, not just out of gratitude for the life he had saved, but because she believed in the power of redemption. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Two souls bound by a twist of fate, working to heal not just bodies, but the very fabric of justice itself. Little did they know, their journey was far from over. The coming months would test their resolve, challenge their beliefs, and ultimately reveal the true depths of forgiveness and the transformative power of second chances. As the first rays of dawn broke over the New York City skyline, Sarah Thompson stood at the window of her modest apartment, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. Her eyes were fixed on the distant outline of the courthouse, where in just a few hours Richard Blackwell's fate would be decided. The past year had been a whirlwind of legal battles, public scrutiny, and personal growth. Sarah had stood by Richard throughout it all, a beacon of support and a reminder of the man he once was, and could be again. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. A text from Emily Blackwell. "We're on our way. Thank you for everything, Sarah. Truly." Sarah smiled softly, remembering the countless nights spent with Emily, strategizing Richard's defense and, more importantly, rebuilding a marriage that had been on the brink of collapse. Through it all, Sarah had witnessed a transformation in both Richard and Emily, a rekindling of love, trust, and mutual respect that had been lost in the pursuit of success and status. As she prepared to leave for the courthouse, Sarah's eyes fell on a framed photo on her desk. It was a picture from the pro bono clinic in the Bronx, taken just days before Richard's arrest. In it, Richard stood beside her, both of them surrounded by grateful clients and dedicated volunteers. The joy in Richard's eyes, the sense of purpose radiating from him, was palpable even in the photograph. The journey to the courthouse was a blur of nervous energy and quiet reflection. As Sarah entered the imposing building, she was immediately engulfed by a sea of reporters and curious onlookers. But her focus remained steadfast, her eyes scanning the crowd for the faces she sought. She found them near the courtroom entrance, Richard standing tall despite the weight on his shoulders, and Emily, her hand firmly clasped in his. As Sarah approached, Richard's eyes met hers, and a silent understanding passed between them. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Sarah shook her head, a gentle smile on her face. "You already have, Richard. You've thanked me by becoming the man I always knew you could be." As they entered the courtroom, Sarah took her place in the gallery, her heart pounding. The proceedings seemed to stretch on for an eternity, a parade of testimonies, evidence, and legal arguments. But through it all, Richard stood firm, his voice unwavering as he confessed to his past misdeeds and expressed his deep remorse. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the judge cleared his throat, ready to deliver the verdict. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence. "Mr. Blackwell," the judge began, his voice stern but not unkind, "your actions over the years have caused harm to many. However, your willingness to come forward, to make amends, and to actively work towards restitution has not gone unnoticed." Sarah held her breath, her hand finding Emily's in a gesture of solidarity. "Taking into account your cooperation, your work with the pro bono clinic, and the numerous character witnesses who have attested to your changed nature, this court sentences you to 5 years of probation and 2,000 hours of community service. You will also be disbarred, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was a lenient sentence by any measure, a chance for true redemption. As the judge's gavel fell, sealing the decision, Sarah felt tears of relief and joy spring to her eyes. She watched as Richard turned to Emily, enveloping her in a tight embrace, before his eyes sought out Sarah's in the crowd. In that moment, as their gazes locked, Sarah saw not the arrogant lawyer who had once humiliated her, nor the broken man who had faced his deepest failures. Instead, she saw the brave officer who had saved her life all those years ago, a man of courage, compassion, and integrity. Hours later, as the sun began to set, Sarah found herself back at the pro bono clinic. Richard and Emily stood beside her, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "So," Richard said, turning to Sarah with a hint of his old smile, "where do we start?" Sarah grinned, gesturing to the stack of case files on the desk. "We start right here, Richard, one life at a time." As they settled in for a long night of work, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with pain, forgiveness, and unexpected twists of fate. But here, in this small office, dedicated to helping those in need, she knew they had finally found their true calling. Richard Blackwell, once a symbol of corporate greed and moral bankruptcy, was embarking on a new chapter, one of service, humility, and redemption. And Sarah Thompson, the young doctor whose life he had saved twice over, would be right there beside him, a living testament to the power of second chances and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the city lights flickered to life outside, casting a warm glow through the clinic's windows, Sarah, Richard, and Emily bent over their work, their voices mingling in quiet discussion. They were no longer defined by their past mistakes or traumas, but by the choices they made each day to be better, to do better. In that moment, surrounded by the promise of lives they could change and the warmth of newfound purpose, they understood a fundamental truth. Sometimes the greatest act of healing is not in mending bones or winning cases, but in rebuilding the human heart, one compassionate act at a time. And so, as night fell over New York City, a new story was just beginning. A story of redemption, of unlikely friendships, and of the incredible power of forgiveness to transform not just individual lives, but the very fabric of society itself.
So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.